Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to say a big thank you to I don't know. So first, I want to extend a big thank you to Julie, who organized all of this, including making the slideshow that you'll see after we have our initial memory sharing here, and that will run continuously afterwards, both here and out in the cafe, so that you can mix and mingle and watch the pictures and quotes and so forth at the same time. I also want to thank Craig and Tony and Brian and all the other grad students who helped with making sure that that the supplies got where they needed to be and directed traffic and parking and all that sort of thing so that we could all be here today. I thank you all for being here today. My name is Susan Courtney. I'm currently the chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, and it still seems very unreal to say that because the chair should still be in Steve's hands. When it became clear about a year and a half ago that Steve needed more time to spend with his family and his health and his students, he told me that he was glad that there was someone here who was willing and able to take over that job for him. I told him at that time that I came here because of you. I am still here because of you. I'm willing to do the job because of you. And if I prove capable of doing the job, it will be because of you. I first met Steve when I was a postdoc at NIH, when functional magnetic resonance imaging was just being developed. And Steve invited me to come to Hopkins and teach him and his students about the method. And as I was leaving, he asked me, as I later learned he asks every student he encounters, where are you headed? What are you doing next with your research? And I told him that I wanted to do more cognitive neuroscience, less on the engineering side, but I felt I still had a lot to learn, and so I was going to stay in my postdoc for a little while longer. And his response was, yes, I think you're right. That's a good idea. And somehow the way he said it, it didn't hit me at the time that he was agreeing that I still had a lot to learn. Instead, it really motivated me to think. Did I hit something? No. To think that that he seemed to think that my plan to be a faculty member in a department like his was actually realistic. And 2 years later, he hired me, even though I still had a lot to learn. And so for the next 16 years, he had an office next to mine. And I still expect to hear those brisk, purposeful footsteps stop outside my door and ask me a question or tell me the latest news from one of his students or one of his daughters. He never talked about himself or his accomplishments. It was always about other people. Steve was a mentor to me in many different ways. And he was a mentor in many different ways to many other people. You'll hear today from Steve's PhD advisors, his graduate students, his undergraduate students, and his contemporaries in all of his relationships, he led by example. His passion for science was clear, but he was very humble about his own position in that. He was always pushing his own understanding, looking to learn something new, and he did this by listening to other people, collaborating with other people. You didn't always realize that he was teaching as he was listening and learning, but his Socratic way of asking questions was very effective. He taught me how to write grant applications by asking questions, by asking questions in a way that again, was humble and respectful. He never said, do it this way, write it this way. He said, this is too complicated. I don't understand what you're getting at here. And then you read it again. Oh, of course you don't, because it wasn't written well. He always zeroed in on exactly what the most important information was, whether that was in an experimental design or any other issue. He was the bedrock of the department because he always knew what was most important in life as well as in science. If I was still in my office when he left in the evening, he told me to go home too. He also knew how important it was to recruit people to his lab and to the department who would not just crank out papers and grants, but who would also build a strong community. And I am grateful for the community that he built, and I thank you all for being here and being part of that community. There are many other people who I know have memories to share. We don't have a fixed order of who's speaking when, but whenever you feel ready to speak, you can just stand up and come on up. Do we want to start with the youngest or the oldest, or Howard?
Yes. Well, certainly the oldest. So I first met Steve in 1986 when he came for a job interview. So he had gotten his PhD from my graduate alma mater, University of Michigan, and he was highly recommended by several people there, including my former JHU student, John Yantis, and my former fellow Michigan grad student, Dave Meyer, both of whom are here today. Now, the Yantis and Meyer recommendations were particularly important to me because these guys are members of a tiny and regrettably shrinking set of people whose evaluations of a scientist I consider definitive and dispositive. So after reading Steve's application, I assumed the search was over. There was the small obstacle of, the other members of the committee and all those other applicants, but really the search was over. So, but Steve was smart. He knew he didn't just have to impress the experimental psychologist on the committee, that was Alfonso Karamazza and me, but he also had to impress the mathematical psychologists, Warren Torgerson and Bert Green. So he gave his main talk on mathematical modeling work he did with Dave Meyer and Keith Smith on the analysis of multinomial mixture distributions. And he reserved his work with John on the capture of attention for his second talk. And this was a killer combo. And all I can say is well played, Steve. Now, I should say a bit more about Alfonso. Hopkins, of course, is a very small department, but nevertheless, we try to consider ourselves a full-service psych department. And so Alfonso did more for Steve than just vote for his appointment. Alfonso had a lovely, smart secretary who Steve soon started dating. I see her right over there. From the moment we hired him, Steve and I were close. Since John Yantis had worked in my lab at Hopkins, this made Steve sort of an academic grandchild. We had lots of interests in common. We wrote a few papers together, and we began a weekly seminar that has gone on for 28 years. Steve often said that it was the highlight of his week. I completely agree, especially today. This morning we had a special meeting at which John Sorensis, one of Steve's many brilliant students, presented his recent work, and it was terrific. And Steve was already proud of John, but would have really been proud today to hear that talk. Steve was productive. He had published over 100 articles, and more important, they were outstanding publications. In many cases, they reported groundbreaking research. He also edited 2 books on the topic of perception, and just this year published a textbook that looks to be by far the best in its field. It's just a beautiful book. In fact, the editor is here today. Where'd he go? Yeah. Oh, yeah, he's here. He spoke very highly of the editor, and the editor speaks very highly of Steve. Not surprising. My opinions about Steve's academic prowess are not just my own. I mean, he's won 2 major national awards, one from the American Psychological Association and one from the National Academy of Sciences. So you might wonder what Steve is like as a teacher and mentor, but you're going to hear from some grad students, or at least one grad student and one undergraduate. Let me give you a perspective from a junior faculty member. This was a comment from Trish Van Zant, whom we hired as a brand new assistant professor. She couldn't make it today, so she wrote to me just the other day. And she said, "Had I been able to come, I would have said something like this. I knew Steve first by reading his papers as a graduate student. His work made a huge impression on me when almost no one else's did. It seemed to me then that his work shone with clarity among other vastly more confusing papers in my stacks of required reading. When I met him for the first time, I was delighted to find that the person who could conceive of such work and merit the highest awards was approachable, friendly, and kind." She continues, "I don't recall at what point Steve became my mentor when I was at Hopkins, but it seemed to me that one day I was drifting, not sure of my future. And the next day, after a casual conversation, he gave me a path to follow. He was the best of mentors, supportive and honest, and able to deliver advice without criticism. He was also the best of friends. When I had to decide whether to leave Hopkins or stay, my major concern was leaving Steve behind. I have missed him terribly being away, and I miss him terribly now. How lucky we all have been to have had him in our lives, if only for a little while." So, when it comes to depicting another person, the story of the blind man describing the elephant always comes to mind. Well, there are things I just didn't know about Steve. For example, it was only at his funeral that I discovered that he was an enthusiastic member of his church's choir. I still can't picture that. However, I wonder if it isn't the case that, the elephant story notwithstanding, I wonder if it isn't the case that everyone who knew Steve knows that he was a person of high intelligence, completely upstanding character, and remarkable judgment. Now, Susan had just described Steve as the bedrock of the department. In an earlier quote, she had said he was always the voice of reason in any debate because he knew how to identify the most important elements in a scientific data set, in a faculty candidate, or in life. Well, I completely agree with that. I always counted on Steve for sound advice on all sorts of topics, and I do mean all sorts. I asked him about the wording of article titles, the structure of grant proposals. I asked him where my son and daughter might get the best education. I certainly asked him who he thought might be a good candidate for grad school or for a faculty position. Well, I miss that advice, and I miss him.
My name is John Yantis. these words won't come gracefully because I have very vivid memories of Steve and continue to. I was Steve's first advisor and a close collaborator while he was at Michigan when he arrived in the early 1980s, and I continued to work with him all the years that I was there, in addition to Dave Myers working with him and supervising his dissertation. Steve and I did a great deal of work together on selective attention. And we continued working together years after. In fact, there were many times when I would pick up the telephone and Steve would be on the other end saying, "Did you hear what somebody said about this paper that we wrote on attentional capture?" And then we would have an argument, and it would turn into a paper. And the paper would involve experimentation that he would do, or I would do, or the two of us would do, and then mature into a piece of work, all stimulated by Steve. And I want to make this point. I have this model that came directly out of my interaction with Steve. I was a young faculty member at Michigan when Steve walked into the door and into my laboratory. And the model is the model is a model of what to me is the perfect graduate student. And that model goes something like this. For the first 2 years that the graduate student is enrolled, they're taking classes and they're being a teaching assistant and working in the lab, and they're getting direction from whoever the supervisor is. And then suddenly, sometime during the third year, early in the third year, the direction of advice changes. And this happened with Steve. I actually have a photographic memory of Steve's walking into my office and talking to me about a piece of work that landed up being the basis for our collaboration for years thereafter. And from then on, I listened and Steve talked. And I would occasionally throw in comments, and it was all under Steve's direction. I have no illusion that during the first 2 years, I had anything to do with that process changing. I think it was just native talent, and it's taking time for talent to develop. But Steve set that model for me, and I continue to use it as the model for what I take to be an ideal graduate student. Let me tell you 2 anecdotes. One is very recent, and the other is about a year old. I'm currently a senior editor at Psychological Science, one of the journals that's published by APS. Senior editors are first sent manuscripts to read and review and decide who should be an associate editor, and then get a second opinion on an article to see whether it should be sent out for review. Just 2 weeks ago, I received a paper that was about whether selective attention was influenced by the long-term history of exposure to a body of material. Now, last year, at just about this time, I was sitting in Steve's office when he told me about this startling piece of work that he and Brian Anderson had done. Brian Anderson, sitting right here, had done, looking at the long hysteresis of selective attention effects in the visual search domain. And honestly, my mouth fell open when I heard that work. 2 weeks ago, I read a follow-up paper, one of, I'm sure, many on this very topic, and I was brought to tears because of the memory, because of the exquisite nature of this work. I give Brian lots of credit for this. I give Steve lots of credit for this because it's emblematic of his entire career's worth of science. The second anecdote is this. It also happened a year ago. I came to Hopkins, I gave a talk, spent some time with Steve in his office. We were chatting about all kinds of things, his textbook, his family, of course, his health. We were chatting about the talk that I had given, the work that I'm doing now. And very generously and kindly, Howard and Steve and I went out to dinner. Place downtown, really excellent restaurant. Charleston, I think it was called. Am I right? So this is now 3 generations of scientists. Sorry, the grandfather. The father. I have more gray hair than he does, so I don't feel all that much better. And Steve. We sat around for a few hours, eating, drinking, partly reminiscing, partly talking about science, partly gossiping, of course. And it is the memory that I want to have of Steve for many years, because he was lively, engaged, talkative, listening, reminiscing. It is the vivid memory that I have of him when he was a graduate student and that I hold with me now. Thank you.
I'm Dave Meyer, who was Steve's other main doctoral advisor while Steve was at the University of Michigan. I've known Steve since he first came and interviewed there in what probably was winter or spring of 1980, after he had been spending a couple of years in Buzz Hunt's lab at the University of Washington. Haven't spoken with Buzz recently about these matters, but I'm quite sure that he wishes he could be here too, because Buzz Hunt was a major influence on the course of Steve's subsequent life, and in some sense, Steve's real life, most of while he was alive, was actually probably back in Seattle on the other coast. I know he really did love the Northwest and what the state of Washington had to offer. So as we think about the overall arc of Steve's life, I think it's important to keep those considerations in mind, even if not all that many individuals from the state of Washington are able to be here today. There are various stories I could tell about Steve, but as Steve pointed out to me repeatedly when he was trying to explain to him what happened the first time he visited my office during his graduate interview, I'm basically the equivalent of HM with respect to long-term episodic experiential memory, which essentially means, except for a few glimpses here and there, I have none. And consequently, I think what I'm going to do now is not so much share individual anecdotes, although I think those are enormously important. And I would certainly agree with everything that Susan, Howard, and John have said so far about Steve and his essence. But what I'd actually like to do with this very brief period of time is make a few meta remarks that occurred to me when I was thinking about what's this occasion really supposed to mean, and what are we supposed to take away from it. And as a result of pondering all of that, a whole bunch of random little thoughts came to mind. They're not really linked in a narrative that is especially coherent, certainly not in the form that Steve would have liked when he was writing a journal article or a grant proposal, but I do think they're sort of relevant for what we leave after all is said and done. So one of the things I asked myself is, should we consider the events that happened during the last 2 or 3 years in Steve's life to be especially unique and unusual? And of course, in some ways they are, but in other ways we can point to previous examples of a particular category into which Steve definitely now falls, which is that of the great scientist who dies too young. And in a way, that's what has wound up happening with Steve. So if you look back over the course of the past 60 to 75 years, which is also roughly the era in which Steve lived, we are immediately drawn in terms of our attention to folks like Alan Turing, who died at the age of 42. Kenneth Craik, who was a bit earlier in terms of when he passed away, another great British scientist who died in 1947, and in some sense was the founder of human performance theory, which then brings us to David Marr, a great young vision scientist who died at the age of 35 a while back. And of course there was Paul Fitts at the University of Michigan, of whom Howard and John well know, who died of a heart attack at 53. And now what we have in the same category is Steve Yantis, one of the greatest attention scientists of all time, who, because of the circumstances of fate, has passed away. But this leads to sort of the second thought, which is that when push comes to shove, Steve hasn't passed away at all. And the reason is because if you think about what life really is, and we need to do that because anyone who thinks about what's really happening sooner or later comes to that. Schrödinger, the great quantum scientist, in fact, wrote a whole book called What is Life? And ultimately, the answer is that life is a dynamic pattern in matter. And the matter in which the pattern happens to be embodied at any one time, in some sense, doesn't really matter. What matters is the nature of this pattern. And if you think of Steve Yantis as being a certain pattern in matter, and you ponder what is going to be the fate of that pattern, well, the fate of that pattern is essentially it's going to be immortal as long as life continues on this planet and evolves into the future elsewhere if we manage not to blow ourselves up sooner as opposed to later. And if you think a little bit harder about this in detail, what you will notice is that Steve's pattern is like everywhere in this room. He's present in his colleagues, he's present in his family, he's present in all of his students who are here, he's present in his books out there, he's present up on the screen. It'd be really hard to obliterate that pattern. In fact, it can't be done. There's no way this is going to happen because he's not just in this room, he's everywhere else on this planet where anybody cares about psychological science, cognitive science, and so on and so forth. When we then ask ourselves, why are we here? And are we here feeling sad and sorry for Steve and what happened to him? Or are we feeling sad and sorry for ourselves because one of the forms in which Steve Yantis was manifested has now faded from the present? The answer, it seems to me, and I know this is really kind of counterintuitive, but if you do a careful analysis of it, it basically becomes the bottom line, which is we shouldn't be feeling sorry and sad for either Steve or any of the rest of us, because Steve in the flesh had a wonderful life. I mean, if you've been looking at these pictures up here on the wall, I can't imagine of anybody who would have had a better life than that. I go through the inventory of everybody I know, and I'm not aware of anybody else who did any better in terms of having a great life in that phase of his or her existence. So, as has been announced, this is a celebration of Steve's life, not a wake. And in that respect, I think we, if we're honest with ourselves, need to leave feeling quite uplifted by the life which happened in his flesh. And furthermore, if you take into account the analysis that I just gave you about where else Steve's dynamic pattern still persists in this room and everywhere else about which we know, well, we haven't lost him either. In fact, we're gaining even more from him, and the fact that we're in this room doing what we are now and allows us to gain even more from Steve, and that's going to go forward ever after. And consequently, while I'm feeling really sad and sorry in some respects, in the end, I got to be really happy and glad that Steve was with us previously, and he'll continue to be that way as time goes by. And I thank you all for having this occasion, which I do think is really important to help us keep in mind what it all really means. And thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter Gordon. I had never worked with Steve, but he and I were in graduate school together for 4 years, and this has been, hard on me as it has for everyone else. I want to just talk about a couple of different things. One is a tradition that Steve started for a group of us who were in Michigan in graduate school in the early 80s together, and that is that he around 10 years ago started a tradition where at Psychonomics he and Richard Abrams, who was with us, and sometimes Dave Irwin would take our advisor, or one of our advisors, Dave Meyer, out to dinner. And I remember that last fall at Psychonomics in Toronto, and it was a great time. Steve was still doing pretty well then. I don't think we had any idea that things were going to get worse. And it was a wonderful dinner, and in thinking about that conference, which has been a big part of my career in life, as it was in Steve's, I just wonder what it will be like this fall, but we'll, try to use the occasion to remember him as we did in the past. So that's one memory I'd like to share. The other is that when the news came that things really were getting bad, and there was the suggestion that we send memories to Steve. At first I thought, well, what can I remember that really will mean anything? And something came to me that I realized was exactly right, and that was that there was a Saturday afternoon where he and I were both at work, working hard, and I heard his brisk, purposeful steps. And he came into my office with a transistor radio. There was no internet. Most of you, I expect, know what a transistor radio is. And he had the Tigers game on. And Jack Morris was one of their star pitchers, and he had a no-hitter going into the bottom of the ninth. And we sat there and listened to Morris get the last out. And that just seemed like so much Steve. Then I came up to visit Steve, wanted to make sure it was okay. Steve's family was, of course, very gracious. They also didn't let me in on something they knew when I was talking about, what time of day I could come to visit him. I didn't really know if he could take visitors or not, and that is, when I got there, Richard was there visiting Steve also, and that, made it a reunion, a sad reunion. But Steve was, very interested and engaged, and we talked about his book at length, which I had used with my class. But he also seemed to get, a little annoyed with that, and he wanted to know, what else was going on, what was fun. So I described to him how much I'd enjoyed the previous summer going sailing at the beach, and how I was looking forward to doing that again, and he seemed, really kind of pleased with that thought. And, between the baseball game which because of the internet I could look up and find out the exact date of it, and did. It was nearly exactly 30 years between that game and that visit. And, you know, I think that everyone knows Steve worked awfully, awfully hard, and he loved his work very, very much. But he did pay attention to other things and did enjoy things. And for me, I thought, well, Steve really did have, and I have had, good fortune in my career, in our careers, and in our families, and in our relationships. And it's very hard how quickly 30 years goes by. But it's very nice to be able to share memories about Steve with everyone.
So hi, my name is John Sorensis. I was a graduate student with Steve, and I just thought I'd share a couple stories. So the first time I ever met him, or heard his voice at least, I was sitting in an office at University of Oregon, and I just applied for grad school, and it was about the time when we were supposed to hear about whether we would get interviewed or not. And so I was, waiting for emails. We had email then; it wasn't quite that long ago. But even though we had email, I heard in the office next door, my advisor at that time got a phone call, and he said, "Hey, Steve, how's it going?" "Oh, yeah, he's over in the lab. Just give him a call. Here's the number." And so I sat there for like 5 minutes waiting, and finally Steve called and invited me out to Baltimore for an interview, which was great, and it is really characteristic, I think, that just that he would take the time to make the personal connection. When I got out here, it had just snowed. And mind you, I'm from California, so that's not an accustomed thing to me. And I'm also not accustomed to moving quickly or talking quickly or doing anything quickly. And I got to his office that morning, and I think this is a major theme that everybody's going to hit on today. But he took me for coffee over at the library here, and by the time we got to the coffee thing, which is only, 200 feet away, he was 10 feet in front of me talking to me. And it was all icy on the bricks. I'm trying to keep up, and I'm like, God, can you just slow the hell down, please? And we got our coffee, got his latte, and we're walking back, and he's racing again 10 feet in front of me, and he hits an ice patch, and his latte goes spilling all over the place. And I remember thinking, that's why you should move slowly. It's not all good. And so then we had to race back and get more coffee. And so, that's one of the memories, though. And, I remember that more often than not. And after 5 years or so, I could almost keep up with him. And that goes for, a lot of the things. He really taught by example. And I remember, very saliently sitting in his office writing the first paper we wrote together. And, he was so patient. He would actually sit there with me. I was, I guess, a first-year grad student then. And, I would write part of an abstract, and then he would look at it for a minute. And, like Susan was saying, his method was to question. He would never say, like, "Oh, this is terrible." But after about 5 minutes, he had deleted everything I'd written and rewritten it as well. But, it was a real learning experience, and it was just remarkable to have somebody who could take the time to do that. So, yeah, anyway, I have a lot of fond memories. But, so the last thing, though, is that he always had a smile on his face. And I know even the last time I talked to him in May, he just had so much going on outside of work. We all think about him as just hustling around and that, but I remember countless stories about his daughters, some of which I won't repeat today. But, I'd go into his office and he would tell me about his family, and now that I have kids of my own and stuff, I really take to heart his example of we're all busy, we all do a lot of things, but at the end of the day, there's some things that are more important than others. So anyway, thanks.
Hi, I'm Dan Handwerker. I was an undergraduate researcher with Dr. Yantis. And I say Dr. Yantis because even though I'm a professional scientist now, he's one of the few people that, and Dr. Courtney's the other one, who calling them on a first name basis just doesn't roll off the tongue for me. And maybe that'll change at some point, but it's just a statement of how the relationship began. And I was an undergraduate. I didn't really know much about his life outside of the lab of really much anything. And most of my understanding of the significance he had on my life is with hindsight, because that was my world. I worked here for a year and a half with Michael Steinmetz doing primate electrophysiology. And Michael Steinmetz was making a transition into playing around with fMRI, which was a brand new technology at the time. And I said, this is kind of cool, and I'm kind of interested in this. And I said, but I think I want to try and work a little bit more with humans. So he directed me to Dr. Yantis. And I was a little bit unsure about that because I had just taken a class with him, and I actually argued for a grade increase, which is approximately the most annoying thing an undergraduate can ever do with a professor. And I wasn't sure what he would say. By the way, I did get the grade increase. So I wasn't sure, but we talked a bit about what I wanted to do with his group and what I wanted to get out from being an undergraduate researcher with him. And he let me join, and I worked with him for about 2 years. And with hindsight, it was a pretty significant 2 years in both my life and I think his too, because that was just when fMRI was coming up, and he was making the big transition saying, do I want to trust this method? Do I want to use it? He was bringing Dr. Courtney in too, and having discussions. And during those years, there were, essentially we were pulling every significant paper in the field at the time, and we were ripping them apart. And we were looking at every single one saying, I don't trust this, I don't believe this, I don't understand, this doesn't make sense to me. And what was amazing was sometimes I don't understand, don't make sense means I'm smarter than this and I know this is wrong. And sometimes I don't understand was, even though he was a professor, he was sitting there in front of a room with undergraduates, grad students, and postdocs saying, teach me. I want to learn. My knowledge is incomplete. Someone else knows more than me. I need to learn this. And this questioning of both his own knowledge and what he knew from other people stuck with me. And only with hindsight, like I said, did I realize that was significant. Not everyone's like that. Not everyone who's a faculty at a university is going to get in front of a room and risk embarrassing themselves, risk saying this doesn't make any sense to me, and have someone else say, oh, it's obvious, it's this way. But that was what he did, and he was always willing to sort of ask the question whether the answer was obvious or not obvious, and really didn't make a difference who it was, what it was, if you were an undergraduate or a famous researcher somewhere else. He was always asking those questions. And, I've had many great mentors since him, but both my mentors and others, that's not something I take for granted, and it's something I try to model too. The last thing I want to say is I left his lab saying, I've been trying to think of how this link happened. But I left his lab with my graduate school applications into bioengineering programs, saying I was interested in working on fMRI methodology because I thought fMRI was a really useful tool that was not quite at its prime, and that we got to improve it, we got to figure out how to make it work better, how to make it both a more robust tool for cognitive neuroscience and for clinical applications. And that's been my career for the next 14, 15 years. And what happened in Steve Yantis' lab that made me write that application, that made me say, this is what I want to do? I can't say it was any one conversation, any one discussion, but I left the lab working with Steve on essentially what my path has been for my life to this point. And I'm very thankful for him for that.
it's going to be really hard. But I'm glad I could go after John, because he's half the reason I'm here. So I worked with Chip Folk before I came here on studies of attention using behavior methods, and John Sorenses and Steve had recently done some papers using very similar theories and testing them using fMRI, and they were such beautiful papers, and I remember being so inspired by those papers, and I thought to myself, if you can make me like John, that'd be a really good thing, and I'm going to be like John, and you were his mentor, and so hopefully there's something special about you that can make me like that, and I'd like to study under you and to learn to be like that. And so I applied to work in Steve's lab, and I applied to other labs as well, of course, but I knew 100% where I wanted to be. It's the only school I really cared about. The other ones were just sort of backup schools. They were great schools with great people, but my heart was set on working with Steve. And so he gave me the interview, and when I showed up for the interview, I had this awful, awful cold. I was so sick, and I thought to myself, I'm going to do so well to fake it. He'll never even know it. It's going to be the best performance ever. And years later, he went back and he said, you know what, I almost didn't accept you because this sickly guy comes into my office. I can barely understand what he's saying. But all the other faculty really said that I should accept you, and I'm sure glad I did, and I'm sure glad he did too. I remember when I got the call from Steve to tell me I was accepted. I was in the dentist chair getting my teeth worked on, and I've been going to a dentist my whole life, and I knew the hygienist really well, and so I was telling him that I was applying to these schools, and so my phone rings, and I say, "Oh, just sorry," and I'll just ignore that, and then they said, "Well, maybe it's Johns Hopkins calling you to tell you you've been accepted," and so I just looked at my phone, and it was a Baltimore number. Of course, my jaw dropped, and I'm like, and she didn't even say, "Oh, you just take it. I'll leave for a second." And so I miss having stuff in my mouth and hardly being able to talk. Got the news that I was going to go to Hopkins, and Steve thought it was pretty funny. I did too, and so the story began. And so I had a lot of expectations about what a mentor like Steve, someone with his success and his power, was going to be like. And some of those qualities met my expectations really well, and some of them surprised me. So I'm going to start off with the qualities that didn't surprise me all that much. I thought thoroughly well, obviously, that Steve would have a very powerful intellect. And of course, you all know that he did. He won all of the many awards that he won for a reason. He was incredibly gifted at what he did. And so just I'll try to give a quick little anecdote of each of these. When I came to interview with Steve, the first thing I noticed in his office, besides Steve himself, of course, was this really intimidating whiteboard he has on his office. And that picture right there of the stars kind of gives me a sense of kind of what it looked like. It's sort of his master plan of all these projects that he's got going on, the different ways that he kind of groups them together and how they're coming along. And I just remember coming to his office time after time, sort of maybe once a week or so, and sort of seeing how this whiteboard was evolving and how all these little pieces were kind of coming together to create a really beautiful picture that defined his life's work, and I was really honored to be a part of that. Of course, I also thought that Steve would be very passionate about what he does, because anyone that's that successful has to have something driving them to keep at it, and Steve's one of the most passionate scientists that I've ever met. In lab meetings, he would vary sometimes, sort of, as meeting progressed, he'd sort of rise more and more out of his chair, almost like he was going to fall onto the table at the end of it. He was a very excitable person. A quick little anecdote, I sort of used that to tease him one time. So a lot of the work that we wound up doing for my last year or so, 2 years I guess, was funded by an NRSA that we applied for and received. And I remember seeing the acceptance letter that this was going to be funded. And so he happened to be around the area, so I brought him over to my computer. And I started reading this letter, and I read it as matter-of-fact, unemotional as I possibly could, just to kind of get a little rise out of him. And so when I got to the part where it said the candidate and his advisor, he kind of gently put his hands on my shoulders and shook me a little, and he said, "That's us!" So Steve was an amazingly passionate scientist, and I like to think that he was able to pass a little bit of that on to all of his students, including myself. His comments, some qualities of Steve that I wasn't sure if I was going to see or not, but I really did in a powerful way. Steve was a very rock-steady person, I would say. He was very unperturbed by all of the sort of challenges that come in the work that he does, which is not always paired with passion, right? Those two things are in some ways in opposition. You have to be excited about the things that drive you, but not crushed and torn when things don't work out the way that you think they will. And Steve had both of those qualities in a really synergistic kind of way. And this is a sort of almost like a side note, but I think it is indicative of that kind of personality. So this is Steve's coffee mug. When Kathy, Steve's wife, was kind enough to allow me to have it as sort of a keepsake of Steve's, and I keep it on my desk. And I remember looking at some old pictures throughout Steve's career on one of the slideshows that you'll see in a minute. And there's this photograph from when he got his tenure. Being a little bit autistic, I sometimes notice these kind of things. So on the table at his celebration, which was in 1994, was this coffee mug. He drank out of the same coffee mug for at least 22 years, probably more. Needless to say, I don't intend to drink out of this cup, but I'm sure glad I have it to remember him, and hopefully this coffee cup will appear in some other pictures as well of joyous moments in my own work. Steve also had a childlike curiosity, and I think this is one of the ways in which we connected the strongest. He did a really good job of kind of hiding that. I sort of wear my childlike traits on my sleeve, and for those of you who know how I typically dress, you'll sort of appreciate the pun there. The graduate students get it. But man, we could really excite each other when we talked about our work. And to get his eyes to light up and that huge smile to come on his face, it took about 10 minutes of just talking science and life. Steve had these beautiful childlike qualities that I share as well, and that I think should be embraced by more scientists. Some people kind of find that a little bit embarrassing, but I think that's part of what made Steve as powerful of an intellect as he was that he was willing to ask very basic questions and to question things with a curiosity that would spur you on to want to know more and to be enthralled by the beauty of the human mind. So what about Steve's less common traits? I thought a long time about wanting to find sort of one word that would capture the essence of Steve best. You can never do that in one word for any person, but I wanted to find the word that came the closest. And I couldn't, but I did find one word that I think very accurately captures the antonym of what Steve was, the exact opposite of who Steve was. And that word is vainglory. All one word, vainglory. If you're like me, you've probably never heard somebody speak that word in a sentence. It's a very uncommon word in today's culture because it reflects the idea that glory, and in particular glorifying yourself through your own actions, can be vain. But I think Steve knew the meaning of that word very intimately, and that reflected who he was and how he lived his life. So Steve was a very humble man. This is a book that we had published together. We did an article in it. And there's a lot of very powerful names in this book. It was by invitation only, and of course, someone like me could never touch this, but Steve could. And he included me in on the project, being as gracious as he was. And as part of this, each of the individual authors get to write a little biography of themselves. It's part of the honor that you get for being able to do something like this. And the most common thing that people do in this kind of case is they take this as an opportunity to sort of tout themselves and to tell you all about how great they are and how great their work is. So here's one individual. I'm not going to name any names because it's not why I'm here. But here are just some examples. So this individual, I study visual search, inhibition of return, object-based attention, apparent motion, sensory processing, scene perception, oculomotor programming, tasking to changes in eye movements, memory, individual differences in cognition, political temperament, goal-directed activity, as well as the interaction between these cognitive processes. So basically, if you study anything in cognitive psychology at all, you should cite me because I've had an impact in that kind of work. Let's see. I'm funded by Homeland Security, Office of Army Research. I won this dissertation award. Here, I'm a member of the Royal Academy of, I'm not going to name it because I would tell who the person is. In recognition for outstanding psychology research, European Society of Cognitive Psychology, 185 peer-reviewed journal articles, and blah, 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 blah. Here's another individual, I've published in prestigious journals like Psychological Science, Neuroproceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, recipient of this dissertation prize, Early Research Award by Psychological Association. And this other individual here, all the different positions that he's held throughout his career, very prestigious positions. He's even funded by Google, oh my gosh, over 100 peer-reviewed publications. And then at the very end, because his last name begins with a Y, and it's sort of, I think it's poetic in a lot of ways, comes Steve Yantis. And these are, what I just told you there is literally a great example of every other big name in this entire book. So you come to Steve, how's Steve going to talk about himself? In all honesty, he's somebody who, compared to some of these individuals, his accomplishments, quite honestly, surpass them without any argument at all. Steve's biography of himself is 4.5 lines long. Steve is professor and chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, Johns Hopkins University. He received a PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Michigan in 1985, and following a year as a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University, he joined the JHU faculty in 1986. His research interests include selective attention and cognitive control. So if you took away the professor and chair part, that biography could depict just about anybody who's gotten a PhD in psychology. That's the biography of Stephen Yantis, one of the most renowned attention researchers that I know and that many of you know in this room. Steve was a very humble man, and that emanated in all that he did. I remember him going to conferences. He gave a talk once on some of the stuff that we did together. And Steve's a very unassuming person. You have all the different people that they want to draw a crowd around them. They're always in the front row trying to, make sure they're the first to ask a question. Steve was always very quiet. When he came to a talk, he would kind of sit toward the middle, be very contemplative, he'd always take notes. But when Steve came to give a talk, and I remember it so vividly, it's the first time I ever saw him give a talk. It was a very large room, and it's very difficult to get, academics anywhere on time. But literally, before his talk even started, it was standing room only. The amount of respect that people had for Steve and his work was profound, but you would never think that from having a conversation with him at the conference. And he never, in any way, shape, or form that I could perceive, tried to make sure that anybody else, knew that about him. He didn't need to feel significant through those kinds of means. Steve was also very self-sacrificing, and I don't want to belabor this. From some of you at Hopkins, you've heard this story multiple times, but there's a lot of you here who haven't, so I do want to tell it again. It's just one anecdote, but it's reflective of many decisions that Steve made throughout his career to support myself, and I'm sure his other students as well. So this was about a year after Steve and I published that paper on learning and attention that John drew reference to. And almost immediately when we published it, Steve looked at me and he said, I really think that this could be one of the biggest papers that I've ever done. And there was 2 other labs that had done similar work. This is sort of like the very beginnings of this kind of line of thought. And they really had a sense of what the potential was here as well. And so they contacted Steve and they said, we want to get together, the 3 of us, these 3 extremely powerful scientists, and we want to write a review paper together talking about how all this work fits together and then sort of mapping out the future. And when you get 3 people that powerful to sit down and decide that they want to work together, it's really rare, and that's because they all had a sense of what was at stake here. And so the 3 of them were going to have their Skype interview, discussion to try to lay out the sort of ground rules for how this was going to work. And I was so excited about what that could be, what that could turn into. I just remember sort of thinking about it, every day leading up to it. And then the time came when that happened. Of course, I wasn't a part of that. It was just the 3 big heads. And so Steve sort of called me to his office and he said, okay, let me tell you about how it happened. And so I had to use every restraint in my body to sort of not just like run to his office to hear about this. And so he sat me down. And he goes on to recount the kind of conversation that he had. And he said, so at some point, one of the big name scientists, Steve said, I'd like Brian to be a part of this. He was really the sort of driving force behind this work, and he needs to be an author on this. And so one of the other scientists said, kind of half begrudgingly, like, oh, okay, but only if my postdoc is on the paper as well, because I wouldn't want there to be any hard feelings. But the other scientist said no, that there aren't going to be any students or postdocs on this paper. It's just going to be the 3 of us. Only the 3 sort of big minds can be a part of this. And so there I'm sitting there listening to him say that, and I think, okay, what's he going to say now? He's probably going to tell me, okay, so I tried. I really kind of stuck up for you, but it didn't work out. We're going to do it anyway, and maybe you can help out with it, and I'll stick you in a footnote or something. But instead, he goes on and he says, well, I insisted, and what I did was I told him, I'm not going to do it unless Brian is on the paper with me. That's a deal breaker. And the one scientist said, okay, deal, we're not going to do it. And that paper never happened because Steve would not move forward without giving me the recognition that he thought I deserved, certainly at his own expense. I'm sure that paper would have been cited hundreds of times by the time its life was over. It would have been another crown in his feather in his academic crown. But he denied himself that for me, and many other things as well. When he got an invitation to talk about that work at Germany, he then turned it over to me and he said, I want you to go and present it. And it was the first time that I ever had the opportunity to travel internationally. I sort of came from more meager means, and my wife and I went. It was the first time I ever saw a country besides the U.S. and Canada. We had a good time and made what I thought was a good presentation that I thought he would have been proud of. So why was Steve like that? He certainly could have had more accomplishments. He could have had more awards, but he denied himself of those sort of things time and again, and he didn't feel the need to make himself to be significant in others' eyes. And I think that's honestly because he had a very deep and intimate understanding of what the word vainglory meant. He had other priorities. He didn't come to work to make himself great. He came to work to make others around him great. In order to understand Steve, who he was, why he did what he did, you have to understand that Steve was a very spiritually minded person. He sung in a choir because he had something to sing about. So I'm going to share one last story about Steve, and I really debated whether or not I would do this, because it's a very personal story to me, but I really think I have to, because I really think it testifies to the kind of person that Steve was and the kind of person that I want to be. So I've had the honor of standing beside at least a few people as they prepared to die. Not many, but enough to know what it looks like to see somebody who's not ready to die, who's afraid to die, and who is filled with regret at what their life could have been and what they could have done. And I can tell you firsthand that that is absolutely not Steve. So when Steve was recounting to me what was going on in his life and what he knew could happen, he finished it by looking at me and saying, "I know this may surprise you, but I'm at peace with all of this." And it didn't surprise me at all. It was exactly what I knew he would say. And he meant it. I think that's what we all want. That's what I want. That's the mark of a life well lived. Steve had that. And I'm going to carry that example with me to inspire me to live that kind of life, that I can say the same thing when my time comes as well. So, when I was about half a year before my dissertation defense, Steve gave me I guess it's about a year actually. Has a date on it. Steve gave me a copy of his book. He put my name on it, comma, Steve, and the date. But he left it blank. And he said, when you defend your dissertation, I'm going to write something there for you. And there was a time where I wasn't sure if that was actually going to happen. It did. And when it did, I made the decision to keep the book at home. I wanted to keep that space blank. And that's because this isn't over. Steve's influence on my life isn't over. Every time I remember the things he taught me, the conversations that we had, he writes another line in his book. And I look forward to filling in that blank space with every day that I live.